Hello YouTube, welcome to my horror movie channel. So today, I have a bit of a rant for you guys about how I feel that horror movies haven't been scaring people to the same extent that they used to back in the day, say like 20, 30 years ago. The main reason that I feel this way is because we know too much. As John Carpenter put it in one of his interviews, he said, "We're smarter than the movie," and it's true. We can just go online on Wikipedia, whatever, look up a plot synopsis of a movie and basically ruin the whole movie for ourselves before we ever actually see it. And I mean, I have a lot of friends who do this, and I sort of ask them, why do you do this? Why do you go online and find out everything about a movie before you see it? And the answer is usually the same, is that they say, oh, well, I want to find out whether or not I'm going to like the movie. And I'm sort of like, yeah, okay, but you're ruining parts of the movie. Even if you just I don't even like looking at the back of the box of a movie before I go to see it or rent it or whatever. Particularly not a horror movie because it just tells you too much about it. Like if you saw the original John Carpenter's Halloween back in 1978, you really wouldn't know a whole lot about the movie before going in to see it in the theater, aside from maybe seeing the ad, the poster, or maybe if you had a friend who saw it before you, you might ask them, and they'd be like, "Oh yeah, it's about this guy who wears a white mask who goes around stalking, killing babysitters." And you'd be like, "Oh wow, that sounds interesting. I think I'll go see it." But you wouldn't really know the plot points, and because you can find that out on the internet so readily now, that kind of it ruins movies. I think it makes it very easy, and it destroys the intrigue. The fear in the intrigue is gone in a lot of cases. Even if you go as recently, this isn't a horror movie, but as recently as 1999 with the release of The Matrix, there were all these ads. I remember all these poster boards plastered all over the place that said, "What is The Matrix?" Of course, if The Matrix had come out today, um, everyone would know. You'd know months in advance of probably what the whole movie was about. There would be no secret, and it just for that reason it wouldn't be as interesting. It's so it's not even just true with horror. It's true with all kinds of films. So it leads me to my second point about why horror movies aren't as good as they used to be back in the day. We haven't really had a real horror movie villain or boogeyman, whatever you want to call him, since this guy, Freddy Krueger, right? So some people might argue that in the 90s with Scream we had Ghostface, but I think I would argue against that. I would say Scream was more of a parody. It wasn't really. I mean, yes, it had its moments, especially in the beginning with Drew Barrymore being slaughtered. Right, it had its scary moments, but I would argue it was more of a parody. It really wasn't. I wouldn't call it a real slasher film. It was sort of making fun of itself, and same thing a little later on in the 90s with I Know What You Did Last Summer with the Fisherman Killers. It was the same idea. It was a slasher movie that was making fun of itself and sort of being ironic. So I wouldn't call that a horror icon. Probably the closest we've come to having a really iconic villain since Freddy Krueger, which the original Nightmare came out in 1984. The closest we've come since then is probably with Jigsaw and the advent of Saw in 2004. But even with Jigsaw, the most iconic thing was not Jigsaw himself, but the Saw puppet. And it had some staying power while Saw was really popular when it was out. But I always felt that Saw was one of those movies where, when it was released, everyone was talking about it, right? A few months beforehand, you'd be like, "Oh, a new Saw movie's coming out," and everyone would start, on the internet and the fanboys and everything would start talking about it. And then a few months after it came out in theaters, again, people would be talking about it. But now that Saw as a series, they've gone through all 7 of them and haven't had any new ones for a few years, there's a lot less people talking about it. Whereas that's not the case with movies like A Nightmare on Elm Street, franchises that are just really popular horror franchises. So yeah, we need a new Freddy Krueger is the bottom line. Someone who can replace him. And we like even before Freddy Krueger, we had right Friday the 13th, Jason Voorhees, right? We had, as I've already mentioned before, Halloween with Michael Myers, or The Shape, as fans like to call him. And last of like the big four slashers, Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. His chainsaw doesn't want to stay up for some reason. So yeah, that leads me to my next point. Remakes have gotten ridiculous, and originality is, frankly, pretty much dead within Hollywood horror, I think. They've remade basically every really big horror franchise I can think of from the 70s and the 80s, pretty much. Especially when it comes to slashers, right? Nightmare has been remade. Halloween has been remade by Rob Zombie. Texas Chainsaw was, yeah, in 2003. I guess that was a remake. It wasn't a sequel. And Friday the 13th has been remade. What else? I've heard that they're planning on remaking Hellraiser, which I hope they don't, but I've heard about that. They're remaking Poltergeist, which is like it's ridiculous. There's just way too many remakes and not enough originality. And like it used to be back in the 70s and the 80s, Hollywood horror wasn't that bad. It would actually, like you had big studios like Paramount that got behind films like Friday the 13th, which, I mean, Friday the 13th isn't the scariest or necessarily best horror film out there, but it was really successful. And nowadays, it just seems like Hollywood horror in general is really generic. There's not, it just follows the basic formula. Teenagers go out to a desolate location where there's not many people around. They start getting offed by a serial killer, or if it's not a slasher movie, it's more of a ghost type movie where they start seeing weird things. No one necessarily dies, but weird and supposedly scary things happen, except it's not that scary because it's stereotyped. So yeah, we need less remakes. We need more movies like the first Paranormal Activity. Paranormal Activity was actually a really good movie. The sequels really suck, but the first one was original somewhat, and it was a good movie. Movies like The Strangers, even Hostel wasn't, it was grisly. It didn't have that much to it, but it was effective, and no one, it was even different from Saw. No one was really doing anything like that at the time. So my next point is the best horror movies relied mainly on suspense and what you didn't know. Nowadays Hollywood horror likes to rely almost entirely on gore, and that's a bad thing. Relying solely on and also on shock tactics like jump scares, basically. Like if you've seen the 2009 Friday the 13th remake, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That movie is almost entirely jump scares, and like I love Friday the 13th, but that's annoying. It's like it's all they can do to scare you. And it's not good. The best movies relied on what you didn't know, and the intrigue of that created anxiety and tension. And basically, if you have a character, say, with a flashlight in a really dark area, but you don't know what's going to be in there, and maybe nothing jumps out, maybe nothing happens, but you're constantly expecting something to, and your mind is sort of filling in the blank and thinking what could be out there, but you don't really know. That's what made films like the first Friday the 13th. You never actually saw the killer that was Betsy Palmer until the very end. So you're constantly wondering, who is this killer? It played with your head. Even if you go as far back as Hitchcock with films he did like Psycho, you really didn't see that much, and that helped to make it so much scarier than horror films are today, particularly Hollywood horror films. They're just not as scary because they insist on showing too much. And the truth is, no matter how good the special effects guys are, your imagination is gonna you'll be able to come up with scarier things in your head than the effects guys possibly can. So yeah, basically that's my point there. The greatest horror relies on your imagination to fill in the blank. And this leads me to my final point, that basically fear is defined as a reaction to a perceived threat. So when you're afraid of something, you perceive there's a threat, but the key word there is perceived. it doesn't have to be like modern Hollywood horror where there's an obvious threat, like a maniac with a knife or a chainsaw, right? It it can be something that, you just heard a noise in the wall or some weird scratching or some faint shriek or something that you can't quite wrap your brain around, and then your mind starts trying to fill in that blank and say like, oh, maybe it's this, maybe this place is haunted, maybe, I think the best kind of horror is the horror that invokes your imagination. It makes you think and wonder, what could this be? Like the best kind of horror movies I think are like when I saw the original 1978 Halloween, right? I had to walk home from a friend's house just down the street, down sort of a dark, lonely, desolate back lane. And anyone who's seen the original Halloween knows it ends with Michael Myers getting up after he's shot off the balcony of the house, and then all you see is the grass sort of matted down where his body was lying, and it implies that he's still out there. And that's how it ends. It's a brilliant ending, because when I was walking home as a little kid, I was looking all over the place for Michael Myers, expecting him to be around every corner, lurking in every shadow. That's really great horror. That's how it's done. You try to get the audience to look for what isn't there, because as soon as you're looking for something that isn't there, that's when you're truly afraid. Think about when you were a little kid and or you're relatively young and you're left home alone and you hear a sound and your mind starts trying to fill in the blank about what that could possibly be. That's fear. All right? It's not just some maniac brandishing a chainsaw on your face. That is a type of fear, but it's more of terror, and the overt terror and gore, yes, that does define horror to a certain extent. And I mean, my uh, YouTube name is Gorehound Eternal. So yes, I like horror with gore. Horror should be disgusting and terrifying and so forth. But that's not all that horror is. And I really feel like, especially Hollywood horror nowadays has lost the subtle art that made horror what it is, and what has been like what made it great, basically. And basically, so fear is a reaction to a perceived threat, and fear has been around forever. It's always sort of that emotion that everyone wants to sort of downplay and pretend it's not there, and that makes it taboo. That actually makes it more terrifying, is that people sort of want to pretend it's not there. Because if you think about it, fear is the first thing that any human feels, right? You're in your mother's womb and you've got this nice warm place and it feels safe and happy and whatever, and then suddenly upon your birth you have to face this cold world with this bright lights and you don't get what's going on, so you're terrified even before you experience your mother's love, and that comes later. The first thing you feel is fear. It's just any human being. So it's like somewhere way there in the back of your brain, and you always sort of want to push it to the side and pretend it's not there. So that's why when it comes out in the shadows, and when you're looking at things, and your imagination, again, it fills in the blank better than anything, because fear is the oldest emotion that any human being has ever felt. And yeah, so basically, yeah, that's my horror movie rant, is that horror movies are not the same. We know too much. The fear and intrigue is gone. We need a new iconic villain who's actually scary, because frankly, Freddy, Jason, Michael Myers, they were scary in their day when they had the first few movies about them, but they became over commercialized, like any successful franchise ever, but horror in particular likes to over commercialize their successful franchises. So we need a new iconic villain like Freddy Krueger that is original. The explanation for why maybe the boogeyman or slasher can't die. We need a new one. I don't know what it would be, but something new that's scary and hasn't been done to death, basically. So yeah, no more remakes. Hollywood, just getting ridiculous. I'm guilty of going to these remakes, so I can't. I love the franchises, but Hollywood's killing the franchises, and I have to sort of as a community in horror, we have to try and stop ourselves from going to these remakes. We have to try and say no to Hollywood and say, you know what, we want something original. We're not just going to pay money to see regurgitated crap, right? We want something original. And yeah, the best horror movies relied on suspense, they relied on intrigue, and they relied on fear. So we need something like that. We need a new boogeyman, and we need horror to not rely so heavily on gore and shock tactics. So that's pretty much it. We need something new like that. Yeah. Anyway, that's about all, and I'll try to make a new horror movie update or rant or whatever once every week, 2 weeks or so. Anyway, see you later, YouTube.